And so, and on top of all that, we now have this dynamic where everyone that has a 3.5% mortgage is marooned, because if they get a 7.5% mortgage for that, and they just trade it up to a bigger house or a nicer house, then their mortgage is going to be like double. And of course, their property tax will probably go up too. So that's it's not really a smart move. So you're kind of trapped with what you have because of your mortgage.
Well, yeah, you bring up a good point. We talk to a lot of our clients. We talk about this liquidity and the fact that you need to preserve your purchasing power. And I think that the wealthy understand that, and there are certain things called real assets that really maintain their value through thick and thin. Housing is certainly one of them. Gold and precious metals, land, farms, forestry products. I'm sure good businesses they all do that. And when you get this bubble, you get people, and it is. If you have a good idea, you get when this bubble, this slide just illustrates it so beautifully. When there's so much money around, people can do almost anything, but you do have to have a good credit. And I think that has a lot to do. They don't teach this in schools. They don't teach you how to maintain a checking account and pay your bills and save a little bit of money. And what you've been talking about, the fact that this has been going up exponentially, and it's compounding. They don't talk about the compounding effect, which gets to be monstrous when you get further out. So we've had this huge bubble, and this is what's been driving our inflation. It is coming down. You see this little pop right here? Well, I put my cursor. I don't think we can see that. You see where that red line came up and it came down with the. That's where Credit Suisse and Silicon Valley Bank and Republic and the banks started failing. The Federal Reserve put that liquidity in, and yet the banks, I think, are in pretty big trouble because their M2 is being drained. A lot of their reserves are being drained. They have, I think you mentioned that too, that a lot of these guys had bonds, thinking that you're going to be prudent and buy long-term bonds when they're 1 or 2%, and now they're 5 or 6%, 7%. I understand the LIBOR, I think, is 6.75%, 7.25% for bank interbank loans. So they lose a lot of value pretty quickly. Let me go to my next slide here. This, I think, is what you're talking about too, with your capital being siphoned off from labor, because it seems like it's going to the top tiers. And do you think this is going to cause some kind of a civil strife further on or change? There's been a caste system in India for 10,000 years. We in America, you can go from being poor to being rich pretty quick. Sometimes you do that trip a couple times,
It's a very interesting question, Michael, and it kind of goes back to our topic of cycles that we're going to get to. Is that we can see eras in American history, for instance, the Gilded Age, right, the 1890s, where the tremendous industrialization that occurred in the U.S. in the last half of the 19th century made a number of people extremely wealthy, right? And they, a lot of them, like Rockefeller and Carnegie, got wealthy by eliminating competition. So they controlled their market, and so they could guarantee nice profits on their steel and oil products. But they also did their industrialization at the expense of workers. The wages were suppressed, unions were busted, and and then that created a lot of social and economic strife, because then the workers went on strike, and there was a lot of conflict around that distribution of the gains of the economy. In other words, if your economy is growing, it's generating gains in productivity and wealth. Now, who gets that gain? That's the question of politics and the market economy. And so the market economy is based on rewarding people who come up with faster, better, cheaper products and services. But that market can be manipulated if someone can control the market with a monopoly or a cartel, and then they can scoop up more than their fair share at the expense of the consumer and the worker. So this chart is from the Federal Reserve FRED database, and it shows that wages percentage of the national income, the whole economy, has been declining since the 70s. And you can look at all kinds of charts and statistics that say the same thing, that wages have gone up rather slowly, if at all, once adjusted for inflation, where capital, the assets we're talking about, stocks and bonds and enterprises, they have gone up a lot. And so the people who are depending on their labor have been shortchanged. They've gotten very little of the gains of the U.S. economy, and the people who own the assets, the capital, have collected most of the gains. And so even within wages, there's a lot of evidence that it's the higher end of the wage spectrum that's earned most of the gains in income. In other words, it's the people who have done well in the globalized, financialized economy. They're the ones who've picked up most of the gains. So the average worker is not really earning. They're not really earning more than they did 45 years ago. In fact, I think they're earning less if you compare what you could earn, what you could buy, what we call purchasing power. Like what would $1,000 buy you 30 years ago or 20 years ago, and how much will it buy now? And of course, in the vast majority of cases, it's buying less now. So there's that issue too with affordability of housing. Is there's less money available after you pay your mortgage and property tax and insurance to spend on other things, and so the economy tends to stagnate because discretionary income has been reduced by the high cost of housing and taxes and related, housing related costs.
Yeah, I was astounded at the I think it might have been one of your blogs that I read. They're talking about the profit margins is what 11.2%, between 11 and 12% of GDP.
Yeah,
that's a historical level. I think over $2 trillion of profits in the last 10 years. I mean, that is almost obscene, because I think that 5% was really set for for pretty much what we're talking about. This is your chart. This is what you're talking about with the transfer of wealth from the top 0.1% versus the bottom. And we see real estate really, I hate to tout my field, but real estate has been one of the only ways that people that are on Main Street are able to get into wealth, because buying a property, buying a home when you're young, when you go right into family formation, it was one of the easiest ways and most tried true ways for you to save for your older. The National Association of Realtors comes out with statistics that shows that people who bought a home and have a home, they've got 20 times more assets than those who didn't rent. And that's just an astounding figure. And housing has been one way that people can go ahead and improve their lot, because you're right. There's kind of like a group that if you're not in a group, you don't get it, because these multinationals have really, I was just astounded to find out how much money they were taking. And this transfer of wealth from one section to another is pretty high.
Right, Michael. And I think a couple of things that I'd like to introduce here is like, well, what do we do now if you're not rich? And so I myself built my own house, and I know that not everybody has that set of skills, but I want to mention two ideas that I've been promoting or discussing on my blog.
Yeah,
one
great.
is the mini house or the micro house, and this is a movement, and it's not a gigantic movement, but it's I think a lot of young people are interested in it. And I've seen some being built myself. Is that if you can only afford X amount to build a house, then you go ahead and just build what that amount of money allows you. And if it turns out to be 400 square feet, then just go ahead and build the 400 square feet, because you can always add on. I don't know, if you put in the plumbing and you have a little kitchen and a bathroom, then you can always add on bedrooms and other stuff, especially if you design the residence with that in mind. And I like that idea, because if you're given the option of something unaffordable, like, well, you can't buy a $600,000 house, but you could swing a total cost of, 150, then you try to do what you can. The other idea I have is that, we discussed briefly that there's these huge, as you said, these huge demographic shifts that go over decades. And what we've seen, one of the ones is, as you mentioned, from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt, but there's also from the countryside and small towns and rural areas to the big cities where all the jobs and the money is. And now that seems to be reversing because with remote work, then a great many workers are no longer, required to live in a suburb and commute to the city center for their job. So there seems to me to be an opportunity for people that don't want to compete or cannot afford a house in an urban center to look for smaller cities or towns that have affordable real estate still that are not yet on the wealthy classes radar. Where if you're going to try to go to Aspen or various other places, Vail, you're not going to be able to compete. But there may be other towns that have good quality infrastructure and a lifestyle that you could afford. And so I'm kind of anticipating, if you will, a reverse of that demographic move from less, more rural or smaller towns and cities to the big city centers. I'm foreseeing a move back to smaller towns or cities because of the affordability and that I think is a big reason to move, and I think that's one reason why people are moving out of California. Is they're realizing they'll never be able to afford a house. And so therefore, you really don't have an option. You have to move and find a place with a house that you can afford. And then you're looking for other amenities, such as the infrastructure, schools, transport, weather, there's a lot of different factors and jobs. But I think that there's a lot of really pretty nice small cities in the United States that have lost population and that might have available housing where if you go into the big metropolitan areas, it's unaffordable. So what do you do?
You and I are from a generation which you only spend what you can afford. You buy what you can afford. If you can't afford it, you don't buy it. And if you need to move somewhere to afford something, you and I and our generation would have done that. There are places in Kansas, Texas, and Oklahoma that will actually go ahead and subsidize you if you'll come and move into their towns for 2 years. They'll give you $10,000, $12,000 to come move and pay for your moving expenses to come, because they're, like you say, they've lost population. I agree with you. I think these are absolutely wonderful. We here in Phoenix, not to tout my market, but that's one of the reasons we're getting a lot of industry here is that the Amazon moved here because an Amazon a warehouse worker can buy a house for what he makes, like $25 an hour. He can buy a home. He and his wife can put their kids to a good school system and live in a crime-free area and still work in a warehouse. And this is just great for you get good workers and the workers get a good place to live. That used to be the corporate trade-off. When I was in school, we had ethics, and that ethics told you as you climbed the social scale, as you became more and more wealthy, then you had to go ahead and your responsibility was for those behind you to make sure that you gave back. And I think some of this has been forgotten along the way. This is your bubble symmetry. Your work on this, Charles, was just spectacular. This is just unbelievable. I love this chart. How did you do this? What made you get this?
This was just so obvious. And those of us who like cycles or are interested in cycles and bubbles, this is the .com bubble in the United States stock market, circa the late 90s and early 2000s. But you could look, and many people have, and you could look at the South Sea bubble in 1720 or the tulip craze bubble or the 1929 stock market bubble, and they would have very similar look. And so this chart, this .com chart, just so happens to perfectly display bubble symmetry, and that you see that it goes up in certain phases, and then it declines in certain phases, and it pretty much returns to where it started.
And you've done this on the S&P as well, did you not? On the current one, I don't know if I've got that chart. Let's go to my chart, because when I saw that, I looked at it and said, "My gosh, this looks just like mine." This is just we're coming to the same conclusion from two different methodologies. And for me, I'm thinking, well, we are really long in the tooth for this cycle. And look, all the signposts for me of an imminent downturn are there. And we have, I represent money and I represent investors. I mean, I'm still in a brokerage community, but when we have discretionary capital, and we call it capital, not money, that's the difference. It's capital. It's to be used. Money is to be spent. Capital is to be used. And our capital we have not been deploying any capital. We've been doing 1031 exchanges, as you have said, moving from areas that have really overvalued, like Seattle and lots of places in California. We're getting a lot of people from Chicago that are relocating their investments via a 1031 exchange, and that works just fine. We have been very, very cautious about deploying capital because I think we're at the top of the cycle. And this is yours looking at mine. I think we're right up here at number one. That was the number one peak. That's where I think in housing is. And look, you could have done this for me, Charles. This was just phenomenal. I just love your work. So in our housing, I put this in on your chart. We would call these the two mid-course corrections. They come about 7.5 years into the cycle. On an 18-year cycle. Here, each cycle is a little regional for us, and Phoenix Metro led the way last time in the early '80s, and we started in long before the RTC problem. Ours started like in '87. So here in Metro Phoenix, it was 19.5 years was the prior cycle, and that took us into the 2005 and 2008 debacle. But if you look at this, so typically this is the mid-course. It fits perfectly. You can see your two downturns. Those would be called our mid-course corrections. And this up phase coming up, that's called our accumulation phase, where you know that you're going to be getting an explosive phase. And this is what went on before, is that we had this explosive phase, and that happened in 20 and 21, where that's where you get FOMO. That's where you get people outbidding each other. That's where you go to a cocktail party and all they talk about is the house they bought and how much money they've made. And, if one property is good, 10's got to be better. And this is where money is being spent and everybody's excited. And in mine now, if you go back to my cycle, this is stylized, of course. There's actually two peaks in these, just as you laid out. A lot of people don't see that. Well, when I saw it, I went, "Oh my gosh, I know that cycle." And so the first peak for us came in really first end of the first quarter of 2022. I actually called it March 2022. Some people say it was April of 2022. It's regional, so we're not too terribly concerned as whether it was 30 days or 2 weeks or whatever it was off. And then it came down in Phoenix. It came down 11.5%, which would be this right side of the one. And it came up about another 6.5%, which is where we are now. We think that we've had peak number 2 is in. I'm waiting for one more data point. We had, I think, the peak number 2 here in Metro Phoenix came in June of 2023, which would have been almost textbook perfect. And July came in under June of 2023. August came in same as July, which is really odd. So I'm waiting for one more data point, but I do think we're coming down this waterfall area. And I'm a capitalist, so when these finish up and they come down to the bottom, we'll know that those are our 3 buy points. And at first buy point, right of the center line, that's what all the trophy properties are at. That's where people have sold these properties because they had to sell them. They were really, really good properties and they needed money, so they sold those. So that looks this is. Your chart is exactly like ours, and it just keeps repeating itself. We'll look at mine a little later because this is kind of what you're talking about. I'll let you talk about your chart here. This is another fabulous chart of yours. Good work, Charles. Just really, really good work.
Well, thank you, Michael. I borrowed this from another analyst who you can see his Twitter or tag at the bottom of this chart. But it does show that this is a particularly steep bubble. The second bubble is a lot steeper and therefore more extreme than the previous bubble in the 2000 to 2006 cycle.